Good morning. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to Connection. I hope everyone had a very Merry Christmas. I was talking to Miss Doreen as we walked in today, and I asked her if she had a nice holiday, and she said, yeah, but I'm so tired. I said, me too. Last night, we all went out to my brother's house, who had cooked us a beautiful meal, and after we ate, everybody was in the living room, and they were in the floor playing this game, and I was sitting on the couch, and before I knew it, I just completely dozed off. And when I woke up, I said, I'm sorry, I'm not being any fun. I'm just too tired. So anyway, that's the good kind of tired, though. When you've had so much fun, you just have to go to sleep. So before we start, I would like to acknowledge a very special birthday. Mr. Ben Mullen's birthday is today. Happy birthday, Ben, if you're watching. Yay. So let's start with our prayer of surrender. Spirit of truth, carry me where you will. Bring to me what you will. Take from me what you will. Awaken in me what you will. The Christ man is around me. The Christ mind is in me. The Christ power flows through me. And the Christ mystery exists as me. I believe it, I perceive it, and I receive it. I am surrendered. Amen. And so it is. Today's devotion is called Stillness Speaks, and sometimes that's exactly what we need after a few days of hectic celebrating with lots of friends and family and noise, right? We need some stillness. So let's read the affirmation together. God has never given me or his creation the silent treatment. God is not childish or moody. There is a constant flow, a living word, a fresh manna always coming from the mouth of God. However, there may be times when I am not hearing God or agreeing with God, and there may be times when I am looking for God's voice everywhere except within. I will not allow circumstances or distractions to convince me that God is not speaking to me. Instead, I will learn to be still and quiet long enough to connect to the voice of God within me. All right, so the text goes on to talk about a pretty common view shared by many pastors that during the 400-year period between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament, that God was silent and did not speak to his people. The premise being that he wasn't going to tell them anything new until they had heard the last thing he said, or that he was angry with them, or something to that effect. This is a widely held belief, but it's not true for lots of logical reasons that we won't take the time to get into today, but mostly because it's not God's nature to give us the silent treatment. The person who came up with this explanation was suffering from a case of creating God in their image rather than the other way around, because we do get moody and are childish sometimes, but God, as was pointed out in the affirmation, is not and doesn't punish us by not speaking to us. Back to the text. Sometimes we don't hear the voice of God because it is not screaming at us. Okay, so in this world we live in, that sometimes things get so loud, we get so used to the noise that we don't hear anything unless it is louder than the rest of the background noise. Many times the voice of God within us is a still, small voice, almost whispering to us, giving us impressions, intuitions, and knowings. At other times, there is simply too much background noise, mindless chatter, family drama, work stress, or busy work drowning out the sound of God's voice. In environments like this, we could benefit tremendously from moments of stillness and uninterrupted quietness. And then two scriptures are quoted. The first from Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." The next one from Isaiah 30:15, "In quietness will be your strength." All right, so yes, sometimes when we don't or can't hear God's voice, it's not because he's not speaking. It's either that we're not listening or because his voice is being drowned out by other noise, and it's just as simple as that. So let's say the ending prayer together now. Still small voice, today I will get still and quiet, surrender, connect, breathe, sense, and hear your voice within me. Amen. All right. Deep breath in. And now we will say our connection affirmation together. I allow perfect health in my body, perfect peace in my mind, perfect unconditional love in my heart, and the perfect divine timing of spirit to guide my life in thought, word, and deed. On Sunday, my brother said a couple of things that started me thinking. As he often does at the beginning of his sermon, he made a disclaimer. He said, eat what you can. If there are things I say that you don't agree with, at least for now, just take them home in a doggy bag and take them out later. They may taste better then. And he says some version of that statement, as I said, pretty often, followed by this one. Religion tells you what to eat. Most religions have a set doctrine, which is just a list of the things that they believe. Sometimes it's called a creed. Christianity has one called the Apostles' Creed. And it's just like a plate of food that's already been prepared for you. You don't get to look at the menu or anything. You just come and are handed this plate already full of pre-selected food and are expected to eat it all and not ask any questions. And some religions even require you to memorize certain litanies like this as a child, and then they repeat these beliefs over and over every single time that they gather. But spirituality, on the other hand, he always explains, is more like a buffet. You choose the food you like, or in spiritual terms, what ideas resonate with you, what you know will work best as fuel for your particular body, what agrees with your personal digestive system. In spiritual terms, of course, religion doesn't give you that option. Here's another statement he makes a lot. Religion tells you what to think. Spirituality teaches you how to think. And I would add, to think for yourself. So again, let's go back to the analogy of a meal. When children are very young, babies, what's the only meal they have? Milk. They just drink milk. That's it. Then they go through a stage where they're spoon-fed. Then for a long time, their plate must be made for them. But eventually, they mature to the point where they can make their own plate and even choose their own food if their parents allow them to, and then someday cook and prepare their own food. And spirituality is the same. The more mature you become, the more you understand that you can choose what you want to eat spiritually for yourself, what fuels your spiritual practice the best and agrees with and resonates with your spirit. But there's a catch. Maturity also brings with it wisdom, or at least it should. So you can't just eat sugar and candy 24/7 and expect to have a healthy body and for your teeth not to rot out. So you have to feed your body what makes it function to its optimal level. As a part of the maturing process, you've got to figure out what those foods are that keep you feeling strong and good and well balanced. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What is healthy religion? I'm calling it, what do you want to eat? Benny, every Tuesday morning, I send Benny a text telling him my title so he can put it on YouTube and wherever else, Facebook and all that. And so sometimes I'm running a little bit late and he'll have to send me a text, what's your title? So this morning I sent him back, what do you want to eat? And he sent back, I don't know. And I was like, ha, 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 you got jokes. Benny also always sends me grammar-related jokes, which are hilarious. So anyway, we're going to talk today about healthy religion, or rather spirituality, and what the process is for determining which spiritual foods you should choose to get the best effect for you. The new year is right around the corner, which, by the way, let me just go ahead and say now, we will not be having service next Tuesday. We will come back on January the 9th, and that'll be announced again on Sunday and probably an email and in your bulletin. But next week, we're going to take a little break, and then we'll meet again on January the 9th. So traditionally, though, the beginning of the new year is a time when people make resolutions, one of which commonly is to get healthier. So health isn't limited to our physical body. We also need to manage our spiritual health. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how we can do that more effectively. Speaking of my brother, he and I both went through a period in our lives where we realized the religion that we were brought up in and taught as children in the exact form it was taught to us was no longer working for us. Parts of it were, but other parts of it were not. So we went exploring into other religions and life philosophies, trying to find the truth. Because at that point, we still believed there was the truth out there, one singular truth. And here's the conclusion that both of us eventually came to. There is no one religion or concept or practice or philosophy that is the truth. All of them contain parts that are true, and frankly parts, and I've said this to you before, that are a little bit or maybe even a lot crazy. And the crazy parts are always where man has intervened and tried to help God by putting in his 2 cents of how he thinks it should be. The example is often given that God gave Moses 10 commandments, and by the time Moses and the rest of the religious leaders of the time got finished, they had turned that into over 600 rules and regulations that were expected to be adhered to if you didn't want to be considered an abomination in God's sight. And then by the time Jesus came along, hundreds and hundreds of years later, the law, had become so complicated and unwieldy and impossible to follow that he said, look, I'm going to make it real easy for you. I'm going to simplify all of this. There are only 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 hang all of the law and the prophets. It's interesting that both of those commandments, which Jesus told us were the only ones we really need to follow, have to do with love. Because, here's what Jesus knew. If everyone would just live their lives according to those 2 laws, there would be no need for all the other laws. So what we need to figure out as we grow and mature spiritually is what part of religion, any religion, is healthy for us and which part is harmful. And again, all religions have both. It's our job to distinguish between the 2. It's what we call rightly dividing. And a big hint is what I just said. You can tell if something is healthy by whether or not it's based on love. If there's any part of a religion that's not based on love, showing love to others, acting in a loving way to yourself and others, then it's not healthy. That's a good rule of thumb to follow that Jesus himself set as the precedent. So first we're going to break this down into smaller individual parts and talk about health in general and how keeping our physical bodies healthy is connected to and a part of our spirituality. For this, we're going to go to a man named Dr. Bruce Lipton, who is a specialist in the field of epigenetics. And I've talked to you about him before. And he is one of the pioneers of the science that we now call quantum physics. The title that was given on YouTube to this interview, he was being interviewed, is called Your Beliefs Change Your Body. So he says that amoebas, which are these little tiny single-celled organisms that live out in nature, for example, in a pond, they survive by relating to their environment through these little antenna-like receptors, and then they adjust their behavior in order to better adapt to whatever environment they're in. So we also have cells that would be comparable in structure and in function to these amoebas inside our bodies. So the question is, how do the cells inside our bodies, say maybe in our liver, read the environment around them? Okay, so amoeba, they do it through these little antennas, but how do the cells inside our body read their environment? They are inside us, so they don't have access to the outside environment to know how they need to adjust or adapt in order to survive. The brain is what sends the signals to the receptors on those cells. So the brain, in essence, becomes the interpreter of the outside environment to these cells that are inside our bodies. Now, time out. Let's give this a little context with a comparison. Say you go to a country where you don't speak the language that's spoken there. You're going to need an interpreter, either a person or a device, an app on your phone, or a book that can help you translate from the language you speak to the language the people there speak. And your ability to understand what other people around you are saying and for them to understand you all depends on the proficiency of the interpreter and what he or she decides to say. So let's forget about the apps on the phones and the books for a minute and just say we have a physical interpreter. If you say something, whether or not it's going to be understood by the other person you're communicating with is all in the hands of the interpreter and how accurately he or she interprets what you're saying. If an interpreter has bad motives or evil intentions or just wants to cause some trouble, they could completely misinterpret what you're saying on purpose and make you sound like you're saying something you're not. So my point is, how what you say gets interpreted makes all the difference. So what's coming from your brain, from the outside environment, and how it's being interpreted by the brain and then communicated to the various cells inside your body makes all the difference in how those cells function, what they hear and understand from your brain, which is interpreting these outside signals. If the messages it's sending are off or incorrect, it can make a huge difference in your health. Okay, back to Bruce Lipton. He says, 2 people can receive the exact same information from their outside environment, but depending on how their brains interpret it, they can send totally different signals to their cells. Okay, just like an interpreter can either say, okay, they said they love you, or they said they want to kill you, which those two messages, those two interpretations, they will elicit very different responses from the person that you're talking to. So then he goes on and he gives an example. He says, my liver cells have no way of knowing what's going on in the environment except through the signals my brain sends it, okay? Just like I have no idea what that person speaking in a different language is trying to say to me until it goes through the interpreter. And if my liver cells are receiving signals that have been interpreted through a brain that's filled with fear, what they hear is, get ready for fight or flight. And a bunch of stress hormones are going to be released to my liver cells that then my liver has to deal with. But there might be a person sitting right next to me who is receiving the exact same information from the outside environment, whose brain interprets it totally differently and sends the cells the signal, it's going to be okay, which releases healing hormones. So 2 people in the same environment can send 2 completely different messages to their cells depending on how their brain is processing and interpreting the information, and their cells will react, adapt, and adjust totally differently. So at this point, then the man who's interviewing Bruce Lipton gives another example to make it a little clearer. He says, I am deathly afraid of snakes. I always have been. So my reaction, if I come across a snake out in nature, is going to be totally different from the reaction of a herpetologist, who is someone who studies snakes. I would immediately go into fight or flight, and my system would be flooded with stress. Whereas a herpetologist's brain would interpret that information completely differently. A herpetologist could look at the snake and immediately be able to tell if it was poisonous or not. If it's not poisonous, he might even go pick it up because he would have no fear attached to it. And if it were poisonous, he would also probably know how to handle the situation much better than I would because his interpretation and life experience in that area would be totally different from mine. The responses from myself and the herpetologist would result in two completely different behaviors. So then Bruce Lipton starts talking again, and he says, same signal, different interpretations, and thus different responses. And how we interpret signals is a learned behavior. Somewhere along the line, one of those people learned to be afraid of snakes, and one learned not to be. All right, so how do we learn these behaviors? Bruce Lipton continues by saying that all of our cells have genes, and we used to think that these genes were something that we call read-only, which means we used to think, okay, if you have this particular gene that's been passed down to you from your parents, then you're going to have this particular condition, and there's nothing you can do about it. But now, thanks to the field of the study called epigenetics, we understand that we have the ability to rewrite our genes. We can actually alter them. He then gives the example of our brains being like computers. Computers, he says, aren't really useful to us and can't actually do any work until we download programs onto them. For the first 7 years of every human child's life, that's all they're doing, downloading programs through observing the behavior of those around them and through the experiences they have interacting with those around them, which is why he said for millennia now, the Catholic Church has said, give us a child until he is 7 and he will be a Catholic for life, because they understood this concept. Now, I know this has been a lot of technical information, but I promise you I'm getting to a point. We're talking today about healthy religion or healthy spiritual practice or a framework of healthy spirituality. So how do we know what's good for us and what is harmful? Well, knowledge is power. When you become aware of something, you can deal with it and interpret it correctly. You can but you can't change or adjust things that are wrong or harmful if you're not aware of them. And he's about to drop some important and very helpful knowledge on us here. He says most of the programs, in fact, up to 60% of them that we as humans have downloaded and are programs that take away our power. They limit us rather than expanding us. Many of them later in life result in a self-sabotaging behavior. And these programs control our lives 95% of the time. All right, time out. We've talked about this before. If we're not living consciously, if we're not making conscious and mindful decisions, then our subconscious programs, which is what he's talking about here, 60% of which, according to his studies, are disempowering, which translates into harmful to us, they are what's running the show 95% of the time, unless we decide to consciously change them. And we're going to talk about how we do that a little later on. I just want to share a bit more of his interview first. He says, after the age of 7, 95% of our behavior is no longer being driven by our creative, conscious mind. That's the part of our mind that holds our wishes and our desires. So when you become an adult or at any point after age 7, if someone asks you what you want from life, you can tell them. And many of us want the same things: happiness, good health, loving relationships, the ability to earn a good living and take care of ourselves. But 60% of the mechanism we use to manifest those things is cluttered up by disempowering programs we downloaded during our first 7 years, which are running things 95% of the time unless we do something to change that. Using our conscious mind is like steering a car. If we're driving consciously, we can steer towards our wishes and desires. Our conscious creative mind is what helps us to manifest those things we want in life. But if we're not paying attention, then our subconscious programs, which more than half of, 60%, are disempowering and self-sabotaging if we're not paying attention, will then steer in another direction entirely. Wow. So that is some important information. How do we change or adjust programs then so that we can interpret all of the information coming to us from the outside environment in a way that is most advantageous to us? That is the question we need to answer. What is it we need to be paying attention to in order to make the necessary adjustments in our behavior to keep ourselves healthy? And we're shifting now from physical health, like we've been talking about earlier with our cells, to emotional and spiritual health. But as we know, it's all connected and everything influences everything else. So the healthier we are emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, the healthier we'll be physically. All right, so before we get to what we should be paying attention to, we're going to go down a little side road, but it is an important one. When we have wishes and desires that don't manifest, we want to know why. When something doesn't happen that we want to know why. And so we start looking for reasons. And often, though, instead of looking inside ourselves, we begin to blame other people or institutions or conditions that we've been exposed to. We say, I haven't been able to achieve my wishes and dreams for my life because I'm a victim of this person or this traumatic event in my life or this circumstance that was caused by some entity outside myself, rather than recognizing it was your own unconscious behavior and subconscious programming that controls 95% of your behavior that created whatever situation it is you find yourself in. Not understanding this is the most disempowering thing we can do to ourselves. We're trying to change the outside world and blend it and then bend that to our wishes and desires when it's our own behavior that's sabotaging all of our efforts to manifest the things that we want. So, all your efforts are unsuccessful when you refuse to see what your programs are. How do you know what your programs are? Okay, so Bruce Lipton says, look at your life. It's a printout of your programs. My brother says this too. If you want to know what your thoughts are, look at what's happening in your life. That you'll be able to tell. Understand that the things you struggle with are not because anything outside of you is preventing you from getting where you want to be. It is your own, sometimes invisible to you, programming. That's where the sabotage comes from, and yet you want to blame everyone and everything on the outside and think you're just the recipient of all this without recognizing you are the creator of everything you perceive to be happening to you. So then Bruce Lipton, in the course of this interview, he looks directly into the camera and he says, listen, quantum physics is the most valid science on this planet. And principle number 1 says consciousness is creating our life experience. You want to change your life? You don't change the world outside you. You change your own consciousness and then watch the world around you change. Okay. So, as I said before, that was some powerful information and knowledge right there. And it's going to help us now as we begin to look at how we change our own consciousness so that we'll be able to live more mindfully and more on purpose and less driven by our unconscious or subconscious programs, which puts us in a much better position to be able to discern what spiritual practices and religious frameworks are healthy for us and which ones are harmful. The thing that needs to change is our interpretation of the information coming in to us from the environment. Because, as we said before, interpretation is what sends the signals to our spiritual cells, as it were, of either health and well-being or fear, dysfunction, and sickness. So for this, we're going to go to Esther Hicks. The particular talk of hers I want to share portions of with you now is called Letting Your Inner Being Guide You to the Magic You Seek, which is just another way of saying what Bruce Lipton was referring to as our wishes and our desires. And our question is, how do we go about changing our programming so that our brain interprets information in a way that is healthy rather than harmful? Or we could say in a way that's conscious and mindful rather than unconscious. So before I even get into this, I'm going to go ahead and say that some of you, maybe all of you, might find yourselves disagreeing with one of her basic premises here, because most of us have been programmed to believe things like this. Hard work pays off. We've all heard that. No pain, no gain. We've all heard that. Where there is no struggle, there is no progress. That's too good to be true. Be suspicious of things that come to you too easily. You don't appreciate the things that you don't have to work hard for, etc., etc. That's been the basic programming for most of us, all of which flies in the face of Esther Hicks' her most basic premise, which is the path of least resistance. How many of you have heard her talk about that? Okay, that's a big theme of hers. So the minute I say that, I bet some of you have an automatic emotional response that was something to the effect of, well, that's just lazy. Or, well, that's just taking the easy way out. Or, that's just not realistic. But this is my question to you that I have asked you before. Who says the hard way is better than the easy way? Why do we believe that? Down in your heart of hearts, if you're being honest with yourself, don't you pretty much want things to be easier rather than harder? I know I do. Don't you just love it when things are easy? Look at the word that it comes from, ease. Wouldn't you rather live and move with ease as opposed to in conflict and struggle all the time? So that's a no-brainer for me. It's like trying to slog through a creek going upstream rather than, as Esther Hicks always talks about, just turning around and going with the flow, or even walking on the beautiful little stepstones that are usually, and if you look hard enough and you're open enough and you're connected enough to source, you'll always see the stepping stones that you can go across rather than having to get down in the creek and fight against the current. Okay, so I was talking on the phone recently with one of my cousins, Bishop Jim Earl Swilley, and he was reminiscing about a time in his life when he decided to just stop arguing with people about whether or not hell is real, and as in the sense of a place of eternal torture where God presumably sends you if you're not a Christian. And we were laughing because I was remembering that in one of his sermons I had listened to, he said, "Fine, if you just have to believe there's a hell it up." And so that's what I'll say to you today. If you just have a burning need inside yourself for struggle and for doing things the hard way, then fine, struggle it up. Wear yourself out. But there is a different way, and in my opinion, it is a better way. So let's see what Esther Hicks has to say about it, and how this relates to what we're talking about today is this. It's not the only way, I'm sure, but it is one way to change your own consciousness, like we've been talking about. She says, the path of least resistance is the path that your inner being is calling you to, where you have the least resistant thoughts and can follow those along most easily. In other words, it's the path of your least resistant thoughts. All right, time out. Let's go back to what Bruce Lipton was saying about how our brain interprets information. What feels more resistant or creates more resistance? A fearful thought or a thought that's full of ease? Which one of those causes more resistance inside you? Fear or ease? Okay, what calls to you or draws you to it most? A happy thought or a sad thought? An angry thought or a forgiving, gracious thought? Think about that. Back to Esther. Look at it this way. Your inner being knows where you are in relation to where you'd like to be. It's aware of how close or how far away your reality is from your wishes and desires. And it also knows that the least resistant path between the two, it knows what it is and is offering to you all day, every day, satisfying thoughts to lead you along the path, the stepping stones. The path of least resistance is the one you feel most satisfied on. When you, in any moment in time, are feeling satisfied, then that's a very good indicator that you are flowing in the same direction as your inner being. Okay, so remember, we've talked about this before, that the only time you feel negative emotions is when you are not thinking about a situation or a person in the same way as your inner being, or what we might refer to as your higher self, because that is what causes inner conflict and discord. If you're right along with what your inner being is thinking, you're fine. But the minute your mind starts thinking a different way than what your inner being is thinking, that's what creates that conflict. When your thoughts are in line or aligned with your higher self, then you feel satisfied, at peace, and happy, because that's always the state your inner being is in. Your inner being is never in conflict or afraid or offended. Okay, back to Esther. When you're feeling satisfied, then your lower self, your ego, is not in the way. It's not offering any resistance. So therefore, there is no feeling of inner conflict. But if you are standing in an attitude of dissatisfaction, if you're complaining about what is and wishing it were different, then you are holding yourself away from and outside of the path of least resistance that runs from where you are to where you want to be. Okay, thank you, Esther Hicks. That is the end of the piece from her. So let's start wrapping this up by tying all the pieces together that we've talked about today. We began by talking about healthy religion. And we said that all religions contain aspects that are helpful and healthy, as well as aspects that can be harmful. And usually these come about when man has inserted his thoughts into it and created a bunch of rituals and dogmas that God could really care less about, like the people in Moses' day turning the 10 Commandments into over 600 Levitical laws. And what was the solution to that? It was when Jesus came and said, look, all these laws are way too complicated and hard to follow. This is all you need to do. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself, which, as we said, necessitates loving yourself first. So now we've established that the basis of a healthy religion or any spiritual practice must be love. Being in a state of unconditional love for God, for yourself, and for others is the healthiest way to live. And whatever aspect of any religion or any spiritual practice that gets you there is what you should be aiming for. And how can you tell when you're in that state? Because it feels good. Your emotions are your indicators. Anyone who's truly honest with themselves will tell you that loving someone feels better than hating them. And that emotions like joy and peace and ease and satisfaction feel better than emotions like fear and jealousy and anger. And if and when you ever find that negative emotions somehow do feel better to you, then understand that's a program that got downloaded into your brain somewhere along the way that is faulty and needs to be adjusted, because these emotions are never emanating from your higher self or from your inner being, as Esther Hicks calls it. And they will also never lead you to your wishes and desires, even if they feel good momentarily, and even if you think you can justify them. These are the emotions that always lead to struggle and inner conflict and dis-ease, which often turns into physical disease. So how do we change these programs? As Bruce Lipton said, we run into trouble when we aren't paying attention. But what is it that we must pay attention to? How we feel, because how we're feeling is the biggest and best indicator of whether or not we are in alignment with our inner being. And when we find we're not feeling good, how do we get to a place where we are? Esther Hicks tells us we reach for the happiest thoughts we can in the moment, and we focus on them exclusively. That's the way we shift our consciousness from the inside out, as Bruce Lipton was suggesting. It is our programming that causes us to blame others for where we are or where we are not in life. And it's that same programming, as he said, that causes our brain to interpret things through either a lens of fear or through the lens of love and a general sense of well-being. So which of those lenses we choose to see through affects whether we are healthy or sick, both physically and spiritually. The same principle works on both levels. So basically then it boils down to this. Any aspect of any religion that would cause you to interpret things through a lens that makes you feel bad, such as guilty or sinful or inadequate, or that values struggle and equates it with holiness, that's not healthy. If it's not good news, it's not the gospel. Bottom line, if it doesn't make you feel good, it's not healthy for you, because love always feels good. That's it. Love always feels good. And that's how you know. Healthy people feel good. Unhealthy people do not feel good. It's just that simple. So seek out those things and people and situations that make you feel good, and stay away from those that make you feel bad. You will be a much healthier person if you learn to do that, all right? So I want to end with a story that Bruce Lipton told at the end of his interview. I don't know whether his dad died or whether his parents got divorced, but he was telling a story about the fact that his mother had remarried and in her later life, and the man who had become his stepfather, he called him a curmudgeonly old man. I love that word, curmudgeonly. He said he was never happy. He rarely smiled. He was just serious and cranky and complaining most of the time. And at the end of his life, he was in and out of consciousness for about a week. So Bruce had gone to be with his mom to help her care for him. And so 2 days before the man died, he opened his eyes and he had a few moments of clarity, as a lot of people do right before they pass. And the man looked at his wife with a kind of sad look on his face, and he said, "I didn't have any fun." And Bruce said that he said to himself that day, "That's not going to be me. I am going to enjoy myself so much that at the end of my life, I'm going to say, I had such a good time. I want to come back and do it again." Now, whether or not you believe in reincarnation, whether or not you buy into the law of attraction and everything that Esther Hicks teaches, even if you don't really believe that thoughts become things, okay? Even if you don't believe you can create your own reality, you don't really have to believe any of that to know this. Wouldn't you rather spend the time you have here being happy instead of being sad? Wouldn't you rather spend the time you have here focusing on the good, more on the good and less on the bad? Wouldn't that be a better way to live? What have you got to lose? So instead of that being just a rhetorical question, as it usually is, I'm going to try to answer it right now. What have you got to lose? As in, what do you have to lose and let go of if you want to feel happy and at ease and at peace more than you feel sad and angry and out of alignment? You've got to lose all of the programming that has told you, mostly through religion, that life is hard and always going to be a struggle. That's what you've got to lose. You've got to lose the programming that told you were born in sin and have a sinful nature that you always have to fight and eventually try to conquer. You've got to lose the immaturity that causes you to mindlessly eat whatever is set before you, or believe whatever the person that's up on stage behind the pulpit is telling you to. And grow up enough to choose your own food and eventually prepare it for yourself. Find that direct connection to spirit through that still small voice within you that we talked about today in the devotion. And that's it. Amen? Amen. Simple, like I say, simple, not always easy. Benny, you want to help me? Now, remember, next week we will not be meeting here in person, but I will see you again on January the 9th. We will have the study series tomorrow night, devotion on Friday, and Sunday service.
Blessed always, for the arms of God surround us. Let our joy be so triumphant that we rest in God and say Amen. Blessed always, for the arms of God surround us. Let our joy be so triumphant that we rest in God and say Amen.
Have a wonderful week. Be at peace. I love you.